Emily stood in the narrow aisle between shelves stacked high with children's picture books, inhaling the comforting scent of paper and ink. She ought to be doing her usual midday inventory at her bookstore, Larkspur Pages, but her mind was elsewhere. The call had come precisely at 9 that morning from the director of the local library, Mrs. Jenkins, asking if she could spare some time to discuss an exciting joint project. Emily had agreed, but her heart had sunk the moment she saw the second name on the invitation. Charles Whitmore, the owner of the Ivy Scroll. For as long as Emily could remember, Charles and his bookstore had been her fiercest competition. Both specialized in curated selections for avid readers, and both prided themselves on a warm and inviting space. In their small town, having two thriving bookstores was a blessing for bibliophiles, but a cause of tension for their owners. While the townspeople loved the variety, Emily often suspected Charles was copying her best marketing strategies, and Charles believed Emily was snagging customer loyalty with her personal touches. The rivalry was friendly in spirit, but there was always an underlying tension when they crossed paths at book fairs or literary events. Now, apparently, they were both needed for a community renovation. Emily sighed and walked over to the section where she kept the old, timeless classics, worn copies of The Secret Garden, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and Grimm's Fairy Tales. She ran a gentle hand along the spines, remembering what first drew her to books, those childhood nights with a flashlight under the covers, devouring tales of magic, adventure, and hope. She reminded herself that if the library needed her help, she could find a way to tamp down her apprehension around Charles. After all, the library's children's reading room, the project in question, was a special place in town. She should do her part. That afternoon, she arrived at the library's meeting room to discover that Charles was already there. He stood near the large oak table, arms folded, tapping his fingers against a stack of papers. His tall frame looked even more imposing against the shelves behind him. Though they weren't alone, Mrs. Jenkins stood between them, her eyes bright with excitement. Emily felt the tension settle over the room like a cloud. She nodded politely, and Charles returned the gesture with a faint tilt of his head. "I'm so glad you both could make it," Mrs. Jenkins began, motioning for Emily and Charles to sit. "I know your schedules are tight, but this is important to the children of our town. We have a thriving weekly reading program, and we're about to receive a grant to expand and renovate the children's reading room. However, the committee that oversees the project made a special request. They'd like both our local bookstores to contribute not just funds, but your creativity, your distinct styles, and, if you don't mind me saying so, the charm that each of you brings to children's literature." Emily glanced at Charles. He was regarding her with an expression she couldn't decipher, some blend of curiosity and wariness. Mrs. Jenkins continued, unaware of the silent tension. "I believe this collaboration will be a wonderful opportunity to pool your resources and ideas. Every child in this town deserves a magical space to discover the joy of reading." Despite her initial reluctance, Emily felt a gentle tug at her heart. She couldn't deny the importance of nurturing a future generation of book lovers. But Charles? Collaborating with him would be challenging. She recalled how, at a recent literary festival, Charles snatched up a limited edition set of children's classics before she could. He had outbid her for them all. Later, she saw him display them in his shop window, a triumphant grin on his face. Even so, if the library needed them both, she would do her part. They exchanged phone numbers to coordinate meetings. Outside, the first hint of winter's chill greeted Emily as she made her way back to Larkspur Pages. She tried to focus on the good that could come from this. Maybe, she mused, she'd learn something from Charles. After all, competition sometimes drove innovation. If they could manage to set aside their differences, they might create something truly magical for the children. Before she stepped into her bookstore, she vowed she'd give this project her best effort. For the kids, if nothing else. The next day, bright and early, Emily arrived at the library's children's area, armed with sketches, a binder of decorating ideas, and a determination not to let Charles belittle or overshadow her. To her surprise, Charles was already there, perched on a ladder, measuring the wall. He wore neat khakis and a forest green sweater rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms lightly dusted with flecks of paint from a small brush in his hand. Who would have guessed Charles was willing to do some hands-on labor? She cleared her throat. Morning, she said. You're here early. He gave her a faint smile. Couldn't sleep, so I figured I'd get started. I wanted to see how big the walls were before picking out the right murals. He lifted the tape measure as if in explanation. I'm thinking a magical forest theme, or maybe a starry night sky. His voice had a timbre that was surprisingly warm. Emily blinked. She nodded, then slowly set down her binder on a nearby table, somewhat disarmed. Great minds think alike. I have some sketches that incorporate a whimsical forest scene, complete with hidden fairy doors the children could discover. He climbed down from the ladder, brows raised with genuine interest. Mind if I take a look? Emily hesitated, remembering their rivalry, but held out the sketches. If this was a genuine collaborative effort, she needed to trust the process, or at least try. As he flipped through the neatly drawn watercolor sketches, a tree with large outstretched branches that formed a reading nook, mushrooms and toadstools with hidden seats, she noticed a faint smile tug at his lips. For a moment, Emily saw something else in Charles, not just a competitor, but another dreamer who wanted to make stories come alive for children. These are lovely, he said finally, meeting her gaze. It's charming. You've got a real talent. She offered a small, appreciative smile in return, momentarily forgetting their rivalry. The two spent the next hour discussing color palettes, brainstorming reading nooks, and taking measurements for shelves that would hold everything from picture books to chapter books. Mrs. Jenkins occasionally looked over from the door, her own smile reflecting relief that they were already cooperating. Even so, Emily remained cautious, unwilling to lower her guard completely. During their lunch break, they found themselves in the library's break room. A plate of cookies sat on the table next to a pot of tea and some mismatched mugs. No one else was around, so Emily and Charles made awkward small talk. She asked about his morning routine, and he asked about her store's busiest hours. Eventually, silence descended as they sipped their tea. They were jolted out of the lull by the sound of tiny voices echoing from the hallway. A volunteer led a group of preschoolers into the library, the children's excited chatter carrying through the closed door. Emily and Charles both paused, listening. Their gazes met with a knowing look. This, after all, was the reason they were doing this renovation, to nourish that love of books in children. Charles cleared his throat and set his mug down. I remember being that age, he said quietly. My mother had to bribe me to leave the library by promising to read me an extra chapter before bed. Really? Emily's tone held surprise. I used to sneak out of my house at dawn to catch the librarian before she opened so I could be first in line for new arrivals. I liked the smell of the pages. It always felt like a promise of an adventure about to start. Charles's eyes lit up with recognition. That's exactly it, the promise of adventure. He paused, pressing his lips together as if to hold back a bigger smile. I guess we're not so different after all. Emily felt her cheeks warm. She realized she was smiling too, but she quickly turned away, busying herself with tidying the cookie plate. Maybe there was more to Charles than the fiercely competitive store owner she'd mentally painted him to be. Over the following days, they fell into a companionable rhythm. Each morning they'd arrive at the library to unfurl paint cans, brushes, and rollers, gradually transforming the once plain, beige-walled room into a bright tapestry of storybook delight. Emily's sketches guided them as they carefully painted tall, twisting trees whose branches soared across the ceiling. Charles was surprisingly meticulous and patient, carefully tracing lines that formed hidden creatures in the foliage. Their conversations started harmlessly enough, book-themed banter about what classics to feature on the shelves or which local authors to invite for storytelling events. As the hours passed in shared labor, though, the discussions grew more personal. Emily told Charles how her parents used to own a modest bookstore in a bigger city, how she took it over briefly after college, but eventually decided to strike out on her own in their small town. She missed them daily. They'd retired to Florida. But her bookstore brought her a connection to them and to the memory of her childhood. Charles confessed that he never intended to own a bookstore. He'd dreamed of traveling the world, researching myths and folklore. His father's death, however, meant he had to take over the Ivy Scroll, which had been in his family for generations. He admitted he'd resented it at first, but eventually he discovered that each book on his shelves still managed to send him on a new journey. Emily found herself moved by this story, by the quiet resignation in Charles's tone that had transformed into genuine pride in carrying on his family legacy. One afternoon, they moved on to building new shelves. The library had provided wood panels, nails, and the promise of a local carpenter to assist if needed. Emily was determined to do it herself, and Charles joined her, carefully aligning the boards. They laughed over crooked nails and measured once, then measured again, to ensure each shelf was perfectly level. While Charles tested the sturdiness of a newly completed shelf by placing a small stack of books on top, Emily reached for a hardened rag to wipe dust from her face. "Hey, wash out," Charles warned good-naturedly when a stray hammer slipped from her grasp. He caught it midair before it could land on her foot. She let out a startled laugh and he smiled. Something warm passed between them in that moment, a fragile sense of camaraderie that, for once, had nothing to do with competition. By the time the second week of renovation rolled around, their progress was evident. A beautiful mural wrapped around the room, featuring scenes from classic tales. Low reading tables arrived, accompanied by bright cushions and beanbags. Emily showed Charles a design concept for a fairy tale corner, a little annex with star-shaped lights overhead where kids could sit beneath a small canopy to read. He loved it and immediately offered to help install the twinkling lights. For the first time, Emily could see the children's reading room truly taking shape the way she'd always dreamed it could. Yet with each new day, Emily felt a growing niggle of worry. Long-standing rivalries don't vanish overnight. She still had her guard up, worried that at any moment Charles might revert to his old competitive ways. Deep down, she wondered if she was, in fact, the one clinging to the rivalry out of comfort. Maybe it felt safer to keep her distance. But each time he flashed her a small, encouraging grin or commented thoughtfully on one of her ideas, a piece of her resistance melted. Everything changed the day the new shipment of books arrived. Mrs. Jenkins had pulled some strings to get donations from major publishers, including advance copies of soon-to-be-released picture books and diverse, inclusive children's literature. Boxes piled up in the reading room, and Emily and Charles dove in with excitement, sorting titles, organizing them by reading level and theme. Emily marveled at the vibrant illustrations, and Charles read jacket blurbs aloud, often pausing to laugh or gasp in wonder. While rummaging through one of the deeper boxes, Emily discovered a hardcover edition of a fairy tale she recognized, an old classic about a brave young girl who befriends a dragon, but in a new illustrated format. She let out a delighted sound, showing Charles the intricate artwork. "This story," she said, voice lit with nostalgia. "My mom used to read it to me when I was little. I haven't seen a copy in years." Charles peered over her shoulder, curiosity shining in his eyes. "I've never read this one. Care to fill me in?" In the hush of the newly painted room, Emily found herself recounting the tale. A headstrong child who defied expectations to befriend a misunderstood dragon. Page by page, she traced the elaborate illustrations, occasionally laughing at the comedic bits or pointing out hidden details. Charles listened intently, sometimes leaning in closer with a gentle, "Show me that part again." In that moment, it felt as if they had stepped back into childhood themselves, discovering a treasured story for the first time. When Emily finished her summary, she looked up at Charles and realized his gaze was full of something akin to admiration. Suddenly self-conscious, she closed the book. "Sorry," she said softly. "I got carried away." "No, don't apologize." Charles smiled, a genuine crinkling around his eyes. "I'm the one who should thank you. That was wonderful. You tell stories beautifully. That's a gift." Emily felt her heart flutter. She'd always been reserved around him, but in that moment, she saw him as someone who appreciated the same magic in stories that she did. Their stores were rivals, but maybe, as people, they were kindred spirits after all. That evening, as they packed up their materials, Charles cleared his throat. "You know, there's a reading event next weekend at the Ivy Scroll. It's for local kids, a new monthly storytelling hour we're trying out. If you're free, would you consider being a guest reader?" The invitation caught Emily off guard. It wasn't the sort of question she'd ever expected from him, but she found herself more than a little excited at the idea. "You're sure that's okay?" she asked, feeling like she might be overstepping. Charles nodded. "It was my idea to extend an invitation. I think the kids would really love hearing you read." "I would too." He paused, eyes flickering toward the newly installed shelves. "And maybe it's time we stop seeing each other strictly as competitors. There's room enough for both of us in this town if we try." Emily hesitated, grappling with the sudden vulnerability in his voice. The old suspicion in her threatened to burst forward, but she found herself suppressing it. Maybe he was sincere. "I'd love to," she said eventually. "Thank you for asking." In the week that followed, the final touches were put on the children's reading room. Beanbags arrived, the starry lights in the fairy tale corner were installed, and local artists added a whimsical border of woodland creatures along the lower walls. Emily and Charles beamed as they surveyed the finished space. The library staff bustled around, expressing their gratitude. Mrs. Jenkins even snapped photos, remarking on how the children would be enthralled. And at last, the long-awaited opening day arrived. Parents and children poured into the library, eager to see the newly renovated room. Emily and Charles had worked out a schedule of reading aloud from some of the new book donations. Tiny faces stood bright-eyed as they watched the mural, pointed out hidden fairy doors, and ran their hands over the smooth, brand-new bookshelves. Emily read a charming story about an adventure-seeking mouse, while Charles's deeper voice brought to life a silly rhyming tale about monsters under the bed. The children giggled and squealed, entirely enamored. Standing next to Charles after the readings were done, Emily felt a wave of contentment ripple through her. The kids crowded them, some with library cards in their hands, others pleading for just one more story. Between them, they had held an audience of future readers captive, with nothing more than imagination and words. The relevance of their rivalry faded in that moment, replaced by a gratitude born of collaboration. When the crowd died down, she and Charles stepped outside for a breather, leaning against the building's red brick wall. She could hear the faint hum of traffic and smell the aroma of fresh coffee from the cafe next door. Charles took a steadying breath. "That was wonderful," he said, glancing at her. "I almost forgot we were in the same town we've known all these years." With the children listening so intently, it was like another world. "I felt that too," Emily agreed softly. "Thank you for trusting me to work with you on this, and for inviting me to read at your store tomorrow. I'm looking forward to it." He offered a small, playful grin. "I might have to warn my employees that we'll have someone more talented than me at the storytelling helm. Otherwise, I'll be out of a job." Emily laughed. "I doubt that. If anything, I'm worried you'll realize how silly I can be when I do voices." Charles's expression turned earnest again. "I like your voices. The kids have never been so engaged. You have a unique way of bringing a story to life." She shrugged, feeling a blush creeping into her cheeks. "I just love sharing the magic with them. That's all." He nodded thoughtfully. "That's what I want too. My father always told me that a bookstore isn't just a business, it's a gateway to imagination. Maybe I took it too literally as a competitive advantage, but now I see collaborating can create an even bigger gateway." For a moment, they let the silence settle, simply reveling in the sense of a new bond forming. Emily knew they wouldn't become best friends overnight. There would still be moments when they each scrambled to host the biggest author event or carried exclusive inventory. But she felt sure that something had shifted, something that made room for mutual respect and even a blossoming friendship. On the day of the storytelling event at the Ivy Scroll, Emily walked through the door of her rival's bookstore with a present in hand, the newly illustrated fairy tale she had discovered in the library's donation box. She'd managed to track down a second copy, determined to give Charles one of his own. She found him rearranging a display near the entrance, wearing a bright, welcoming expression. The store felt warm and inviting, with candle-scented air and neatly arranged books on tall "This is for you," she said, handing him the wrapped book. "A thank you present for letting me be a part of your story hour." He unwrapped it carefully, and his eyes lit up when he recognized the cover. "This is the same fairy tale you showed me, Vito. The one with the brave girl and the dragon." She nodded. feeling surprisingly shy. So you can read it whenever you like and maybe share it with your customers. Thank you, he said quietly, holding the book as though it were precious. I. He paused. I'm not sure how to say this without sounding cheesy, but I'm really glad we did that renovation together. It changed how I see things. Emily smiled up at him. It changed how I see you, she admitted, and it reminded me that at our core, we're here to share our love for stories. They moved to the children's section of the Ivy Scroll, where a small crowd was already gathering for the storytelling session. Colorful floor cushions surrounded a cozy chair by an old fireplace. Emily took her seat, while Charles stood nearby, handing out coloring sheets and little bookmarks to the children. Parents fussed with their cameras, and excited little readers peered up at Emily in anticipation. She opened a whimsical picture book, cleared her throat, and began to read. She adopted silly voices for the babbling brook, the wise old fox, and the gleeful donkey, eliciting giggles and applause from the kids. Midway through the story, she glanced up to see Charles watching from the side. Their gazes locked, and he gave her an encouraging nod, as if to say, "Keep going, you're brilliant." Warmth spread through her chest. She felt a sense of trust in this moment, not only from the children enthralled by the story, but from Charles, the person she'd once labeled her nemesis. When the tale ended, the children clapped and clamored for more. Charles stepped in to do another reading, picking up the new fairy tale book she had given him. He introduced it with a smile, telling the kids how this was a special volume about courage and kindness. Emily listened, enthralled as he deftly switched voices for the characters, every bit as silly as she had been. The children were rapt. Emily, however, found herself simply marveling at him. After the event, a group of parents lingered to thank Emily and Charles. A mother with a toddler on her hip exclaimed how their children's reading hour was the highlight of their weekend. Another father mentioned that his daughter couldn't wait to visit both Larkspur Pages and the Ivy Scroll to see which books each had on display. Amid the lively chatter, Emily took a step back, allowing it all to soak in. She caught Charles's eye, and he smiled in a way that said everything. We did this together. They closed the store later with quiet satisfaction. Outside, dusk was settling over the quaint town, with street lamps casting mottled light on the sidewalk. Emily remembered a time when she might have rushed home, scanning Charles's window displays as she passed, analyzing his marketing strategy, or even rolling her eyes at his new arrivals. Instead, she lingered by the doorway, exchanging a few last words with him. I really appreciate everything, she said, hugging her coat closer against the evening chill. Working on the children's room with you reminded me why we both do this. We might be competitors, but we both believe in the power of stories. Charles nodded, slipping his hands into his pockets. I've learned having competition doesn't have to mean hostility. You've inspired me to focus on the community, not just the bottom line. They shared a moment of comfortable silence, listening to the wind rustle the leaves along the sidewalk. This, Emily thought, was the start of something new. A friendship, a partnership of sorts, built on respect for the written word. The renovation at the library had opened more than walls and shelves. It had opened a door in each of them, letting in trust and understanding. Eventually, Emily bid him good night, walking the short distance back to her own bookstore. She paused under the glow of a street lamp to glance over her shoulder. Charles was standing in the door of the Ivy Scroll, waving in her direction. Looking at him in the soft light, she felt a wave of contentment. There was no doubt in her mind that their days of rivalry would wane in favor of a new narrative, one where two book lovers could work side by side, championing the magic of storytelling for every eager child in town. Pulling her coat close against the crisp evening air, Emily turned and continued home, heart light with hope. In a world of stories, after all, who's to say that enemies can't become allies or that competitors can't become friends? Sometimes all it takes is a shared dream, a freshly painted room, and a mutual love for books to show that rivalries, too, can be rewritten into something beautiful.